I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
I have often reflected that there is something peculiarly unsettling about a masquerade ball, though I confess I'd never quite put my finger on the reason until that fateful evening in Montreux. Perhaps it is the way familiar faces become strangers, or how the elaborate pretense of concealment seems to invite the very deceptions it purports merely to celebrate. In any case, as I adjusted my rather uncomfortable domino in the mirror of our hotel room at the Grand Hôtel du Lac, I could not shake the feeling that we were embarking upon something rather more significant than a mere social entertainment. "Come now, Hastings," Major Alec Arbuthnot had declared earlier that afternoon, waving the gilt-edged invitation with characteristic enthusiasm. "You cannot possibly refuse Lady Vivian Ashworth's invitation. The woman has transformed the Villa Bellerive into a veritable fairy palace for the occasion, and half of European society will be there. Besides," he added with a knowing wink, "there are whispers that Monsieur Antoine Dubois will be displaying some rather extraordinary gems from his private collection. The man's passion for showing off his treasures is exceeded only by his talent for acquiring them." The Villa Bellerive, perched elegantly on the hillside overlooking Lake Geneva, had indeed been transformed into something approaching magical. As our motor car wound its way up the Serpentine Drive, the entire facade twinkled with thousands of fairy lights, while the grounds were illuminated by elaborate Chinese lanterns that cast dancing shadows across the manicured lawns. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the distant peaks of the Alps provided a dramatic backdrop to what promised to be the social event of the season. The ballroom itself was a masterpiece of theatrical design. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across walls draped in midnight blue silk, while mirrors positioned at strategic intervals created the illusion of infinite space filled with infinite revelers. The orchestra, positioned on a raised dais at the far end of the room, played with that particular precision that only Swiss musicians seem to achieve, their melodies weaving through conversations conducted in half a dozen languages. I recognized very few faces, of course, that being rather the point of a masquerade, but certain figures were unmistakable despite their elaborate disguises. Lady Ashworth herself, resplendent as a celestial goddess in midnight blue and silver, moved through her guests with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to commanding attention. Near the central fountain, a figure in Pharaoh's robes held court with obvious relish, his golden mask doing little to disguise the proprietorial manner of Monsieur Dubois. The diamond merchant's booming laugh carried across the ballroom at regular intervals, punctuating conversations about his latest acquisitions and business triumphs. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, the renowned Viennese physician, had chosen the somber robes of a medieval monk, though his keen eyes behind the simple mask suggested a man more interested in observing than in prayer. Miss Dorothy Crane, Lady Ashworth's efficient secretary, fluttered about the edges of conversations in the white ruff and cap of a columbine, her notebook discreetly hidden, but her watchful attention to her employer's needs unmistakable. As the evening progressed, I found myself increasingly aware of the undercurrents that seemed to flow beneath the glittering surface of the festivities. Conversations that ceased abruptly when certain individuals approached, meaningful glances exchanged behind elaborate masks, and a general atmosphere of anticipation that seemed to suggest the evening held promises beyond mere entertainment. "Fascinating crowd," murmured Major Arbuthnot, appearing at my elbow with 2 glasses of excellent champagne. "Though I must say, there's something rather electric in the air tonight. Can you feel it, Hastings? That peculiar tension that suggests something is about to happen?" I could indeed feel it, though I attributed it, perhaps, to the natural excitement of such an elaborate social gathering. The masks, I reflected, seemed to liberate their wearers in curious ways. Conversations were more daring, laughter more uninhibited, and glances more boldly exchanged. Yet beneath this surface gaiety, I sensed something else entirely, the kind of charged atmosphere that precedes a thunderstorm. As the grandfather clock in the entrance hall began to chime the approach of midnight, the traditional hour for the unmasking, I noticed that several guests had begun to drift toward the edges of the ballroom, some stepping onto the moonlit terrace, others disappearing into the villa's shadowy corridors. Lady Ashworth herself had excused herself from a conversation with the Austrian ambassador, mentioning something about attending to a private matter before the ceremonial revelations began. "The unmasking should prove interesting," observed Major Arbuthnot, checking his pocket watch. "Though I suspect, my dear fellow, that tonight may reveal rather more than anyone has bargained for." How prophetic those words would prove to be, though at the time I merely smiled and raised my glass to the glittering assembly. The orchestra struck up a particularly haunting waltz. The mirrors reflected our masked faces in infinite regression, and somewhere in the villa's elegant rooms, forces were already in motion that would transform this evening of pleasure into something far more sinister. As the final notes of midnight began to sound, I found myself thinking, quite inexplicably, of my friend Hercule Poirot, and wondering what his sharp eyes would make of this elaborate theater of concealment and revelation. Little did I know that before another day dawned, his particular genius would be needed more desperately than I could possibly have imagined. The final chime of midnight died away, and the moment of revelation had arrived. Throughout the ballroom, hands moved to mask ribbons with practiced elegance, the air thick with anticipation and barely suppressed excitement. The orchestra softened their waltz to a gentle accompaniment for this most theatrical of moments, when familiar faces would emerge from behind their elaborate disguises. I had just begun to unfasten my own domino when Miss Dorothy Crane appeared at my elbow, her white columbine ruff slightly askew and her usual composure visibly strained. "Captain Hastings," she said in an urgent undertone that cut through the surrounding murmur of voices, "have you seen Monsieur Dubois? Lady Ashworth sent me to fetch him for the ceremonial toast, but I cannot locate him anywhere." Major Arbuthnot, overhearing, removed his elaborate Venetian mask with a flourish. Last I saw the fellow, he was holding court near his precious exhibition room, positively glowing with pride over that new acquisition of his. The Empress Josephine's emeralds, wasn't it? "The blue salon," Miss Crane confirmed, wringing her hands. "He established it as his private viewing gallery for the evening, but when I went to collect him just now, the room appeared empty, though the door stood ajar." Something in her manner, a nervous energy that seemed to exceed even her naturally anxious disposition, prompted me to action. "Perhaps we should investigate together," I suggested. "The gentleman may have simply stepped onto the terrace for air." We made our way through the thinning crowd, past guests who were now revealing their identities with delighted exclamations and theatrical gasps of recognition. The corridor leading to the blue salon was dimly lit by ornate wall sconces, their flickering light casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with an almost malevolent life of their own. The fairy lights visible through the tall windows now appeared less magical than somehow ominous, and I found myself unconsciously quickening my pace. The blue salon's door stood half open, just as Miss Crane had described, with no sound emanating from within. I knocked gently and called out, "Monsieur Dubois, Lady Ashworth requests your presence for the midnight toast." When no response came, I pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The scene that greeted us was one of elegant disorder. The room, which had earlier showcased Dubois' remarkable collection with museum-like precision, now bore signs of some violent disturbance. A small table had been overturned, scattering its contents across the Persian carpet, and one of the display cases stood empty, its velvet lining disheveled. But it was the figure sprawled beside the ornate writing desk that commanded our immediate attention. Monsieur Antoine Dubois lay motionless on the Aubusson carpet, his pharaoh's costume in disarray, and his golden mask lying several feet away. His face, revealed in the lamplight, bore an expression of profound surprise, as if death had come upon him with shocking suddenness. Around his throat, barely visible against the dark fabric of his costume, ran a thin line of darker discoloration. Miss Crane gasped and stepped backward, her hand flying to her mouth. Major Arbuthnot moved past her with military efficiency, kneeling beside the prone figure to check for signs of life. After a moment, he looked up grimly. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done. The man is quite dead." It was then that I noticed the details that would later prove so significant. Beside Dubois' outstretched hand lay a length of golden cord, silk-wrapped and obviously expensive, the type used to secure heavy draperies or perhaps to tie back elaborate curtains. His fingers bore traces of what appeared to be blue powder or glitter, as if he had handled something decorative shortly before his death. Most curious of all, the empty display case bore no signs of forced entry. Its glass front remained intact, and the small brass key that had secured it lay on the carpet nearby. "We must summon Dr. Zimmermann immediately," I declared, my mind already beginning to catalogue the various inconsistencies I observed. "And Lady Ashworth must be informed at once. This is clearly a matter for the authorities." Dr. Zimmermann arrived within minutes, his medieval monk's costume lending him an air of somber authority as he conducted his examination. His trained hands moved with professional precision, checking pulse points and examining the telltale marks around the victim's throat. "Strangulation," he pronounced with clinical certainty. The cord was applied with considerable force, then removed. Death would have been relatively swift, perhaps 2 or 3 minutes at most. Lady Ashworth appeared in the doorway, her celestial goddess costume now seeming almost funereal in the room's subdued lighting. She took in the scene with remarkable composure, though I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she surveyed the disorder. "The Josephine emeralds," she said quietly, indicating the empty display case. "They were his most prized acquisition, worth a fortune, he claimed." "The theft appears to have been secondary to the murder," Dr. Zimmermann observed, rising from his examination. "The victim showed no defensive wounds, suggesting he was taken by surprise. Yet the positioning of the cord suggests familiarity. This was not the work of a common criminal." As word of the tragedy spread through the villa, Lady Ashworth took command with admirable efficiency. The remaining guests were gathered in the ballroom, the staff instructed to secure all exits, and a telephone call placed to the local constabulary. Yet even as these practical measures were implemented, I found myself thinking of the various guests I had observed throughout the evening, their interactions with Dubois, and the undercurrents of tension I had sensed beneath the glittering surface of the masquerade. "This is a most delicate situation," Lady Ashworth confided as we stood in the corridor outside the blue salon, now sealed pending the arrival of the authorities. The scandal alone could prove devastating, not to mention the implications for my other guests. "Captain Hastings, you mentioned earlier that you have some experience with such matters." I thought of my friend Hercule Poirot, undoubtedly asleep in his precisely ordered hotel room, unaware that his particular genius would soon be desperately needed. "I know someone," I replied carefully, "whose methods might prove invaluable in resolving this matter with the discretion it requires, a gentleman of remarkable insight, currently residing at the Grand Hôtel du Lac." Lady Ashworth's relief was palpable. "Then I suggest you summon him immediately. Time, I suspect, is of the utmost importance." As I prepared to slip away from the villa unnoticed, I could not shake the feeling that we had stumbled upon something far more complex than a simple theft gone wrong. The precision of the crime, the careful removal of the cord, and the almost theatrical arrangement of the scene suggested a mind of considerable cunning. Somewhere among the masked revelers of this ill-fated masquerade ball lurked a killer whose identity remained as carefully concealed as the faces that had, only an hour earlier, been hidden behind elaborate disguises. The motor car's engine purred softly through the crisp October night as I descended the winding road from Villa Bellerive. The fairy lights that had seemed so enchanting mere hours earlier, now appearing almost sinister against the darkness. My mind churned with the evening's shocking developments, replaying the scene in the blue salon with disturbing clarity. The local constabulary had arrived with commendable efficiency, but their preliminary examination had yielded little beyond confirming Dr. Zimmerman's grim assessment. At the Grand Hotel du Lac, the night porter admitted me with the discreet professionalism characteristic of Swiss hospitality, though his raised eyebrow suggested that my somewhat disheveled appearance at such an hour was not entirely unremarkable. I made my way directly to the familiar door on the 3rd floor, knowing that my friend's precise habits would ensure he was still awake, likely engaged in some methodical activity that helped order his thoughts before retiring. My knock was answered almost immediately, as if Hercule Poirot had been expecting my arrival. He stood in the doorway, wearing his silk dressing gown of impeccable cut, his moustache perfectly waxed despite the lateness of the hour, and his keen green eyes taking in my appearance with that peculiar intensity that missed nothing of significance. Behind him, I glimpsed his sitting room in its characteristic state of perfect order, a small valise already packed and positioned precisely beside his writing desk. "Ah, mon ami Hastings," he said, stepping aside to admit me with grave courtesy. "Your evening of social pleasure has taken an unexpected turn, has it not? You have the air of one who brings me the midnight drama, and I perceive that time is of the essence." "Poirot, how could you possibly know that anything has happened?" I asked, though I should have known better than to be surprised by his uncanny perceptions. He gestured toward the window, where the lights of Villa Bellerive were still visible in the distance, their festive glow now seeming ominous rather than welcoming. The masquerade ball of Lady Ashworth was scheduled to conclude at 1 o'clock, yet I observe that the illumination continues, and there has been considerable vehicular activity along the hillside road. Most telling of all, you return alone, without the good Major Arbuthnot, and your costume shows signs of haste in its removal. These things, they suggest circumstances most irregular. I quickly related the evening's events, from Miss Crane's anxious search for Dubois to Lady Ashworth's request for discretionary assistance. Poirot listened without interruption, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly to one side, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose that indicated his complete attention to every detail. "Most intriguing," he murmured when I had finished, beginning that familiar pacing that indicated his mind was already working through the complexities of the case. "You perceive that the theatre has been well prepared, mon ami. A strangulation that is tidy, a case that yields its treasure without protest, a key that obligingly lies where all may see it. The masquerade. It provides the perfect cover for such a crime, does it not? Everyone disguised, movements difficult to track, alibis complicated by the very nature of the entertainment. Then you believe it was one of the guests? Almost certainly. But observe the method, Hastings. This is not the work of a common thief, but of someone who wished to ensure that the death would be immediately apparent while concealing the actual weapon used. The cord was removed after the strangulation, you say? Dr. Zimmerman was quite certain of it. The marks on the throat were clear, but the cord lay beside the body. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his green eyes glinting with that particular intensity I'd learned to associate with the hunt. Précisément. This suggests someone who wished not merely to kill Monsieur Dubois, but to make a statement in doing so. The theatrical nature of the crime, the careful positioning of the victim, the removal of the murder weapon. These argue premeditation, careful planning. He moved to his writing desk and withdrew a small notebook, his precise handwriting recording the essential facts as I had related them. You mentioned that the victim had traces of blue powder upon his fingers. Yes, quite distinctive. Metallic in appearance, Dr. Zimmerman noted. And the golden cord, silk-wrapped, expensive, not something one would carry casually. The type used for heavy draperies, I should think, certainly suggesting the killer came prepared with their weapon. Exactly so. We are dealing with someone intimately familiar with both the setting and the victim's habits, someone who knew where to find him, had sufficient knowledge of the villa's layout to accomplish the deed and escape undetected. Poirot closed the notebook with a decisive snap. But they have made one crucial error, mon ami. They believe themselves clever, having committed what they imagine to be the perfect crime under cover of elaborate disguise. Yet the very theatricality of their method betrays a mind that cannot resist the dramatic gesture. You believe the killer is still at the villa? Where else would they go? To flee immediately would invite suspicion. No, our murderer remains among Lady Ashworth's guests, playing the role of shocked innocent while secretly observing the investigation's progress. He moved toward his bedroom to complete his preparations. We shall return at first light, when masks have been permanently removed and true faces revealed. By then, the local authorities will have completed their preliminary work, and we may examine the scene with fresh eyes. As we prepared to depart, Poirot paused at the door, his expression growing thoughtful. "Tell me, Hastings, what was the atmosphere among the guests when you departed? Were they merely shocked, or did you detect something else?" I considered the question carefully. Several guests seemed less surprised than one might expect, as if they had been anticipating some form of unpleasantness. Lady Ashworth maintained remarkable composure, though I sensed deep concern about the implications. Dr. Zimmerman was professionally detached, but seemed particularly interested in examining the empty display case. Ah, yes. Each reacts according to their nature, but also according to their knowledge of what has truly transpired. The guilty party will be among them, mon ami, watching and waiting to see if their carefully constructed deception holds firm. Poirot's moustache twitched with what might have been anticipation. But they have committed their crime in the presence of Hercule Poirot, and that, I assure you, is a mistake they shall soon have cause to regret most profoundly. The drive back to Villa Bellerive passed in contemplative silence, the first pale hints of dawn beginning to touch the eastern peaks of the Alps. As we approached the villa, its elegant facade now seemed to harbor shadows and secrets rather than the festive gaiety of the previous evening. The masquerade was indeed over, but as Poirot had observed, the real performance was about to begin. The grey light of dawn was breaking over Lake Geneva as our motorcar wound its way back up the serpentine drive to Villa Bellerive. The fairy lights that had seemed so magical mere hours earlier now appeared wan and tired in the growing daylight, like theatrical props exposed by the harsh morning sun. The elaborate Chinese lanterns hung limply from their wires, and the entire facade of the villa seemed to have retreated into a somber dignity that befitted the tragedy within its walls. Lady Ashworth met us in the entrance hall, her transformation as complete as the villa's own. Gone was the celestial goddess of the previous evening, replaced by a woman of severe elegance in black morning dress, her silver hair arranged with perfect precision despite the obvious strain of a sleepless night. Her relief at our arrival was palpable, though she maintained that aristocratic composure that had undoubtedly served her well through previous crises. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending her hand with genuine gratitude. "Captain Hastings assured me that your discretion matches your legendary skill. I confess I am at my wit's end. The local inspector has been thorough, but I fear he sees only the surface of what has occurred here." "Madame, you may depend upon both discretion and diligence," Poirot replied with his characteristic courteous bow. "But first, I must examine the scene with these fresh eyes of the morning. The night, she conceals much that the day reveals." Inspector Renard, a compact man with intelligent eyes and the patient manner of one accustomed to dealing with the complexities of human nature, greeted Poirot with professional courtesy. "Monsieur Poirot, your reputation precedes you. We have photographed the scene, taken statements from all present, and secured the evidence. The case appears straightforward, a theft interrupted, resulting in murder. The missing emeralds provide clear motive." "Ah, but Inspector," Poirot observed mildly as we made our way toward the blue salon, "the obvious, it is so often the enemy of the truth. The mind that seeks only to confirm its first impression, it overlooks the subtle contradictions that reveal the real story." The blue salon in daylight presented a markedly different aspect from the dimly lit chamber of the previous night. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows illuminated every detail with merciless clarity, from the chalk outline on the Persian carpet to the empty display case that gaped like a wound in the room's elegant harmony. Poirot moved through the space with that peculiar gliding motion I had come to associate with his investigations, his keen eyes missing nothing. "Observe, Hastings," he said, crouching beside the writing desk where Dubois had fallen. "The position of the body tells us much. See how he lies, not sprawled as one might expect from a surprise attack, but positioned almost formally. The victim was facing his attacker when the fatal cord was applied. This argues against a common thief striking from behind, does it not?" He moved to examine the golden cord that had been carefully preserved by the local authorities. Taking it up with gloved hands, he studied its construction with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. Silk-wrapped, expensive, designed for heavy draperies. "But observe, Inspector." He gestured toward the tall windows where the blue curtains hung undisturbed, their matching cords intact and uncut. This weapon was imported for the purpose. The killer came prepared. Next, Poirot turned his attention to the empty display case, producing his magnifying glass to examine the brass lock and velvet interior. No signs of forcing, and the key was found beside the body. This suggests that Monsieur Dubois himself opened the case, perhaps to display the emeralds to his visitor. But why would a simple thief require such a demonstration? "To verify their authenticity?" I suggested. "Possible, mon ami, but unlikely. The reputation of Monsieur Dubois was beyond question, and the Josephine emeralds are well documented. No, I think the opening of the case served another purpose entirely." He ran a gloved finger along the velvet lining, noting how it disturbed the fine silk fibers. "And here we have the source of the blue powder upon the victim's fingers, not cosmetics as one might assume, but the metallic dust shed by this fine silk when handled with some urgency." Poirot's examination extended to every corner of the room. He noted the overturned table with its scattered contents, the untouched decanter of brandy with 2 glasses on a side table, and most significantly, a faint scuff mark on the polished parquet floor near where the body had lain. "A struggle, but brief and controlled," he murmured. "And here," he indicated an impression in the thick Persian rug. "The mark of a narrow heel, not a man's shoe, I think." Lady Ashworth, who had been observing our examination with growing anxiety, stepped forward when Poirot had completed his initial survey. "Monsieur Poirot, I must be entirely frank with you about the relationships among my guests. Antoine was not universally beloved, I'm afraid. His success in business had made him wealthy, but also somewhat ruthless in his acquisitions. You speak of specific grievances, perhaps." Her composure wavered slightly. "Dr. Zimmermann had been negotiating for months to acquire a rare medical manuscript that Antoine purchased from under him at auction, despite knowing Heinrich's particular interest in the piece. Miss Crane's brother, an art dealer in London, had lost several important commissions to Antoine's more aggressive bidding practices. Even Major Arbuthnot had cause for complaint. Antoine had recently acquired a set of military medals that Alec believed should have remained in his family. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his fingers drumming against his chin. "So we have not one potential motive, but several. Each guest harbored some resentment against our victim. This complicates matters considerably, but also provides more fertile ground for investigation." At that moment, Miss Dorothy Crane appeared in the doorway, her usual efficiency strained by the night's events. She had changed from her Columbine costume into a simple grey dress, though I noticed faint traces of glitter still clung to her gloves, remnants of the previous evening's festivities. "Lady Ashworth," she said with carefully controlled composure, "forgive the interruption, but Dr. Zimmermann wishes to speak with you. He's discovered something among Monsieur Dubois' effects that may be significant." We found Dr. Zimmermann in the library, his medieval monk's costume exchanged for a sober morning suit that better suited his distinguished bearing. His examination of the victim had been thorough and professional, confirming strangulation as the cause of death and placing the time at approximately midnight, when the unmasking ceremony would have provided convenient cover for both the crime and the killer's movements. "The removal of the cord after death puzzles me," he admitted when Poirot questioned him about the technical aspects of the murder. "It serves no practical purpose from a medical standpoint, yet it was clearly deliberate. Perhaps to prevent identification of the weapon, or to remove evidence that might connect it to the killer. Or," Poirot suggested quietly, "to tell us something. The theatrical nature of the crime, the careful positioning of the victim, the imported weapon, these speak of calculation, of a message intended for someone other than the victim alone." As we prepared to conduct more detailed interviews with the remaining guests, Poirot paused in the corridor where a shaft of morning sunlight illuminated the polished parquet. He studied the faint impressions left by the previous night's activities, though he made no move to examine them more closely. "The imprint of character is clearer than that of leather, Hastings," he murmured. "We shall now speak with each of our suspects individually, asking them to recount the same small slice of time around midnight. Each will tell it differently, and in those differences we shall find not only the truth, but perhaps the first convenient lie." The masquerade was indeed over, but as Poirot had observed, the real performance was about to begin. Somewhere among Lady Ashworth's distinguished guests lurked a killer whose identity remained as carefully concealed as the faces that had been hidden behind elaborate masks just hours before. The morning light had stripped away the magical illusions of the previous evening, but the most dangerous deception of all still waited to be exposed. The morning room overlooked the lake with serene dignity, its pale blue walls and elegant furnishings providing a deceptively peaceful setting for what Poirot termed the systematic excavation of human deception. Inspector Reynard had positioned himself discreetly in a corner chair, his notebook ready, while Lady Ashworth hovered anxiously near the doorway until Poirot gently but firmly requested privacy for the interviews. "We shall proceed methodically, mon ami," Poirot explained to me as he arranged his chair to face the morning light. "Each person will recount their movements during the crucial period from 11:45 until 12:15. In their words, their hesitations, their small contradictions, we shall find the threads that lead us to the truth." Major Alec Arbuthnot entered first, his military bearing intact despite the strain of a sleepless night. He had exchanged his elaborate Venetian costume for a well-tailored morning suit, though I noticed his hands still bore faint traces of the previous evening's theatrical makeup. His account was delivered with characteristic precision, yet I detected an underlying tension in his measured responses. I spent the earlier part of the evening circulating among the guests, as one does at such gatherings, he began, settling into the chair with practiced ease. Dubois was in particularly fine form, holding court near his exhibition room and regaling anyone who would listen with tales of his latest acquisitions. The man was positively triumphant about something, mentioned concluding a significant business arrangement that very afternoon. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "A business arrangement. This is most interesting. Did he elaborate on the nature of this transaction?" Not explicitly, but he hinted at acquiring something that would, in his words, complete a most satisfying collection. Antoine was always given to dramatic pronouncements, you understand. But there was something different about his manner last evening, almost manic in his enthusiasm. "And your own movements as midnight approached?" A barely perceptible hesitation flickered across Arbuthnot's features. "I stepped onto the terrace for air shortly before the unmasking ceremony. The ballroom had become rather warm, and I found the October night refreshing. I was there when the clock chimed midnight, admiring the view of the lake." "Alone, Major?" "Yes, quite alone. I returned to the ballroom just as word began to spread of the unfortunate discovery." When Arbuthnot had departed, Poirot made careful notes in his precise script. "Observe, Hastings, how he volunteers information about Dubois' mysterious business arrangement, yet becomes evasive when discussing his own whereabouts. The pattern, it begins to emerge." Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann entered next, his distinguished bearing lending gravity to the morning room. His analytical mind approached Poirot's questions with scientific precision, yet I sensed a subtle defensiveness beneath his professional demeanor. "Doctor, your reputation as an observer of human nature precedes you. What was your impression of Monsieur Dubois' behavior last evening?" Zimmermann adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. Antoine was in unusually high spirits, even for him. There was something almost celebratory about his manner, as if he were savoring some private victory. He made several pointed comments about the rewards of patience in acquiring rare objects, remarks that seemed directed at specific individuals rather than general conversation. "You refer perhaps to the medical manuscript he acquired despite your own interest?" "Among other things, yes. But his comments encompassed broader territory. He mentioned something about settling old accounts and completing unfinished business. At the time, I attributed it to his natural tendency toward theatrical pronouncement. And at the crucial time of midnight, I had retired to the library to examine a rare Vesalius edition that Lady Ashworth had graciously permitted me to view. I was alone, engrossed in the text, when I heard the commotion and proceeded to offer what medical assistance I could. Miss Dorothy Crane proved the most visibly distressed of our subjects, her usual professional composure clearly strained by the night's events. She perched on the edge of her chair like a bird prepared for flight, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. The faint traces of glitter I had noticed earlier seemed more pronounced in the morning light. "Miss Crane," Poirot began with gentle courtesy, "you discovered the absence of Monsieur Dubois. This must have been most distressing for one so conscientious in her duties." "Indeed it was, Monsieur Poirot. Lady Ashworth had specifically requested that I fetch him for the midnight toast, a tradition she maintains at all her gatherings. When I found the blue salon apparently empty, I was quite at a loss." "You entered the salon before seeking my assistance?" "Only briefly. The door stood ajar, and I called his name. The lighting was quite dim, and when no answer came, I assumed he had stepped away. I confess I was focused on my task rather than examining the surroundings carefully. Yet you noticed nothing unusual. No disturbance, no indication of what had transpired." Her hands tightened their grip, and I observed a slight tremor in her voice. There was something. A faint scent in the air, something sharp and distinctive. And I thought I heard a soft sound, like fabric rustling, but I attributed it to the curtains moving in the breeze from the terraced door. When Miss Crane had departed, Poirot sat in contemplative silence for several moments. It was then that Inspector Renard approached with a small evidence envelope, his expression grave. "Monsieur Poirot, while examining Monsieur Dubois' effects more thoroughly, we discovered this in his waistcoat pocket." He withdrew a cream-colored calling card, elegant in its simplicity, bearing 4 words written in a bold, decisive hand. "Midnight, Blue Salon, urgent." Poirot examined the card with his magnifying glass, noting the quality of the paper and the characteristics of the handwriting. "Most illuminating, Inspector. The paper is expensive, the script educated but hurried. This was written with some urgency, yet by someone accustomed to fine stationery. The handwriting. Can you determine anything about the writer? The pressure is firm, the letters well-formed but impatient. A person of education and social standing, certainly. But observe this curious detail." He indicated a small smear near the bottom of the card. "Blue powder, very fine. The same substance we found on the victim's fingers." I leaned closer to examine the evidence. "The powder from the display case lining." "Précisément. But consider the implications, mon ami. This card was written before the crime, yet it bears traces of the same powder that Dubois encountered when opening the case for his killer. This suggests the writer had access to the Blue Salon earlier, had handled the display case, and then arranged the midnight meeting." Poirot rose from his chair and moved to the window, where the morning sun now illuminated the grounds of Villa Bellerive with crystalline clarity. We have 3 suspects, each with motive, each claiming to be alone at the crucial moment. But this card tells us something more. Our killer planned this meeting carefully, knew Dubois' habits, and had intimate knowledge of the villa's layout. He turned back to face me, his green eyes bright with that particular intensity I had learned to associate with the hunt beginning in earnest. The masquerade provided perfect cover, but our killer has made one crucial error. They believe themselves clever, having committed what they imagine to be the perfect crime under cover of elaborate disguise. Yet the very precision of their planning betrays a mind that cannot resist the dramatic gesture. You believe the killer is still among Lady Ashworth's guests? Where else would they go? To flee immediately would invite suspicion. No, our murderer remains among us, playing the role of shocked innocent while secretly observing our investigation's progress. Poirot's moustache twitched with what might have been anticipation. But they have committed their crime in the presence of Hercule Poirot, and that, I assure you, is a mistake they shall soon have cause to regret it most profoundly. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to illuminate not just the elegant furnishings of Villa Bellerive, but the complex web of deception that surrounded the murder of Antoine Dubois. Each interview had revealed new layers of motive and opportunity, yet the truth remained as carefully concealed as the faces that had been hidden behind elaborate masks just hours before. But now, with the discovery of the calling card, Poirot had found the first solid thread in the tapestry of lies, and I knew from experience that once he began to pull at such threads, the entire fabric of deception would inevitably unravel. The discovery of the calling card had transformed the morning room into something approaching a laboratory of human deception. Poirot requested that Lady Ashworth provide samples of the villa's stationery, and within minutes Miss Crane appeared with a silver tray bearing cream-colored cards identical in quality and watermark to the one found in Dubois' pocket. The match was unmistakable, confirming that the killer had used materials readily available within the villa itself. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, examining the texture between his fingers, the same deckly edge, the same distinctive watermark of Villa Bellerive. This argues against an outsider, does it not? Someone familiar with the household's amenities composed this summons. Inspector Reynard, eager to advance the investigation, requested handwriting samples from our 3 primary suspects. Major Arbuthnot wrote with the precise, open letters of military training, each character formed with regimental discipline. Dr. Zimmerman's script was compressed and decisive, betraying the impatience of a man accustomed to swift diagnosis. Miss Crane's hand flowed with elegant flourishes, her pressure leaving deep impressions that spoke of both education and nervous energy. "The comparison, it tells us something," Poirot observed as the inspector studied the samples. "But not what you might expect, mon ami. One writes differently under stress than at leisure, and the ink of our mysterious card bears a slight sepia cast that differs from the household pen's true black. Someone carried their own writing instrument, a small vanity that may prove most significant." Lady Ashworth, recognizing Poirot's methodical approach, offered to guide us through the villa's less obvious passages. "The servants' corridor," she explained, leading us through a narrow hallway lined with service doors. "Provides the most discreet route between the ballroom and the blue salon. Anyone familiar with the house would know of this passage." The concealed entrance to the blue salon proved particularly intriguing, a door so perfectly integrated into the wood paneling that it remained invisible unless one knew of its existence. Poirot examined its well-oiled hinges, noting how they moved in complete silence. "Most convenient for one who wished to approach unseen. And which of your guests, Lady Ashworth, would possess such intimate knowledge?" "I'm afraid all of them," she admitted with visible reluctance. "Heinrich has used this route frequently when examining my library. Dorothy knows every corner from her secretarial duties, and Alec has stayed here often enough to navigate the house blindfolded." It was then that Inspector Reynard approached with news that would alter our understanding of the crime entirely. A telegram from Geneva revealed that Dubois had been negotiating the sale of his entire collection to an American museum, a transaction worth several million francs, scheduled for finalization within the week. This casts our theft in an entirely different light, Poirot observed, his green eyes bright with interest. If Monsieur Dubois was liquidating his collection, the emeralds become not merely valuable objects, but symbols of a much larger enterprise. Someone may have wished to prevent this sale entirely. The revelation prompted a return to the Blue Salon, where Poirot conducted a more intensive examination in light of this new information. Using his magnifying glass, he studied the empty display case with renewed attention, noting subtle impressions in the velvet lining that suggested the emeralds had been carefully wrapped rather than hastily grabbed. Observe the precision, Hastings. This argues against panic and towards someone with specific knowledge of handling valuable stones. Our killer possessed not merely motive and opportunity, but professional competence. As the morning progressed, Poirot began what he termed the psychological excavation. Rather than conducting formal interviews, he moved among the remaining guests with subtle purpose, introducing carefully chosen observations designed to probe at hidden anxieties. To Major Arbuthnot, he remarked upon the theatrical nature of the crime, noting how the killer seemed to value dramatic effect. The Major's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his military composure strained by the implication. With Dr. Zimmermann, Poirot focused on the medical aspects, particularly the absence of defensive wounds and the victim's apparent trust of his attacker. Someone with whom he felt safe enough to open his private display case, Poirot suggested, watching the doctor's reaction with keen interest. A vein throbbed faintly in Zimmermann's temple, a small but telling sign of internal agitation. Miss Crane proved most visibly affected by Poirot's gentle probing, her usual efficiency disrupted by nervous energy that seemed to exceed even her naturally anxious disposition. When he mentioned the blue powder found on both the calling card and the victim's fingers, her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the morning refreshments. The psychology, it reveals more than fingerprints, Poirot confided to me as we observed the subtle shifts in behavior among our suspects. Each reacts according to their nature, but also according to their knowledge of what has truly transpired. The guilty party betrays themselves not through dramatic confession, but through the small inconsistencies that accumulate like evidence in a careful investigation. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the villa's elegant rooms, while somewhere among Lady Ashworth's distinguished guests, a killer continued their elaborate performance of innocence. But Poirot's methodical approach was beginning to expose the cracks in even the most carefully constructed deception, and I sensed that the moment of revelation was drawing inexorably closer. It was shortly after noon when Inspector Reynard approached us in the library with an expression of barely contained triumph. Behind him followed a young chambermaid, her face flushed with the peculiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that accompanies the discovery of crucial evidence. In her trembling hands, she clutched a leather spectacle case, its surface bearing the small gilt monogram that immediately caught my attention. D.C. Monsieur Poirot, the inspector announced with evident satisfaction. I believe we have found our missing emeralds. He took the case from the maid with ceremonious care, opening it to reveal the Josephine emeralds nestled within tissue paper, their deep green fire seeming to mock the elegant surroundings of Villa Bellerive. They were discovered hidden beneath the cushion of the bergère in the morning room, the very chair where Miss Crane sat during our interviews. Miss Crane, who had been summoned immediately upon the discovery, stood in the doorway with her face drained of all color. Her usual composure had completely deserted her, and I noticed that her hands trembled as she gripped the door frame for support. "That is my spectacle case," she whispered, then caught herself with visible effort. "That is to say, it was mine. I thought I had mislaid it somewhere in the villa yesterday evening." "Where precisely was this discovered?" Poirot inquired. his voice carrying that deceptively mild tone I had learned to associate with his most penetrating observations. The chambermaid gestured nervously toward the morning room. "Under the cushion of the small chair by the window, monsieur. I was straightening the room when I felt something hard beneath the fabric. I lifted the cushion, and there it was, wrapped in tissue paper." Inspector Reynard's satisfaction was evident as he examined the emeralds more closely. "The case bears Miss Crane's initials. The stones match the description of those stolen from Monsieur Dubois, and they were found in a location where she had ample opportunity to conceal them. The evidence appears conclusive." "Before we draw any precipitate conclusions, Inspector," Poirot interjected with his characteristic courtesy, "permit me the small examination that is my profession." He approached the bergère with careful attention, lifting the cushion to study its underside and examining the chair's brocaded upholstery with his magnifying glass. "Most illuminating," he murmured after several minutes of intense scrutiny. "What do you observe, Monsieur Poirot?" Reynard asked, though his tone suggested he considered such detailed examination unnecessary, given the apparent clarity of the evidence. "Several things of great significance, mon ami. First, observe the surface of the leather case. It bears no impression of the brocade's distinctive weave pattern, which is quite pronounced. Had this case lain beneath the cushion while Mademoiselle Crane sat upon it during our interview, and she sat with considerable tension, did she not, Hastings, the leather would show clear crosshatch markings from the fabric. It does not." Poirot next examined the tissue wrapping with equal attention. "Second, note the pristine condition of these papers. They show no trace of the blue metallic powder we found on both the victim's fingers and the calling card, powder that came from the velvet lining of the display case. If Miss Crane had removed these emeralds from their original setting, traces of that distinctive powder would certainly adhere to both the stones and their wrapping." The implications of Poirot's observations struck me immediately. "You're suggesting the emeralds were planted?" "I'm stating it with certainty, mon ami. Someone wished to create the impression of Miss Crane's guilt, but they underestimated the stubborn persistence of physical evidence. The emeralds were cleaned and rewrapped, then placed in this location after our interviews concluded, but before the chambermaid began her duties. Miss Crane's relief was palpable, though she remained visibly shaken by the experience. "I swear to you, Inspector, I've never seen those stones before this moment. If my spectacle case was used to conceal them, it was done without my knowledge." "Yet someone had access to your personal effects," Poirot observed thoughtfully. "Tell me, mademoiselle, when did you last recall having the case in your possession?" "Yesterday evening, before the masquerade began. I remember placing it in the lady's cloakroom with my other belongings. When I looked for it this morning to retrieve my reading glasses, it was gone." Poirot nodded slowly, his green eyes bright with that particular intensity that indicated his mind was working through the implications of this new development. So our killer not only planned the murder with meticulous care, but also prepared a secondary deception to misdirect our investigation. The theatrical nature of the crime extends beyond the murder itself to encompass the entire aftermath. It was at this moment that Miss Crane, perhaps emboldened by Poirot's defense of her innocence, stepped forward with obvious internal struggle written across her features. "Monsieur Poirot, there is something else I must tell you. I was not entirely truthful about my discovery of Monsieur Dubois' body. The confession that followed would prove to alter our understanding of the crime entirely." With halting words and frequent pauses, Miss Crane revealed that when she had entered the blue salon at midnight, Dubois was already dead. But she was not alone in making this discovery. Someone else had been kneeling beside the body, searching through the victim's pockets with methodical purpose. "I recognized them despite their masquerade costume," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "When they heard me enter, they rose quickly and moved toward the concealed door to the servants' corridor. In their haste, they dropped something." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a gentleman's cuff link, its gold surface bearing the unmistakable regimental insignia of Major Arbuthnot's military unit. The revelation demanded immediate confrontation with the Major, whom we found in the smoking room with the resigned bearing of a soldier who had been expecting this moment of exposure. His reaction to the cufflink's appearance confirmed Miss Crane's account, though his explanation revealed motivations far more complex than simple theft. "I was attempting to retrieve something that belonged to me," he admitted with quiet dignity. "Personal letters written by my grandfather during the Crimean War. Correspondence that Dubois had acquired at auction and used as leverage in various business dealings. When I discovered his body, I saw an opportunity to reclaim what should never have left my family's possession." Poirot listened to Arbuthnot's explanation with careful attention, noting how each revelation added new layers to an already complex web of deception. "So we have not one visitor to the Blue Salon at the crucial time, but two, the killer and yourself, Major. This contamination of the crime scene explains much about the physical evidence." "I had no hand in his death," Arbuthnot insisted firmly. "But I confess I felt little sorrow at his passing. The man was a vulture, feeding on others' misfortunes and sentimentalities." As the afternoon light slanted through the villa's elegant windows, Poirot stood in contemplative silence, his egg-shaped head tilted in that characteristic pose that indicated intense mental activity. The discovery of the planted emeralds, Miss Crane's confession, and Arbuthnot's admission had transformed what seemed a straightforward case of theft and murder into something far more intricate. "We have now reached the first false lead that is not truly false, but merely incomplete," he announced finally. "Our killer possesses a mind of considerable cunning. Not content merely to commit murder, they have orchestrated an elaborate deception designed to satisfy our need for obvious solutions. The emeralds were stolen not for their value, but to provide a convenient motive that would distract us from deeper, more personal truths." He moved to the window, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the villa's manicured grounds. "But they have made one crucial error in their theatrical presentation. They believe themselves clever, having committed what they imagine to be the perfect crime under cover of elaborate disguise and misdirection. Yet the very precision of their planning betrays a mind that cannot resist the dramatic gesture, and that, mon ami, will ultimately prove their undoing." The investigation had reached a crucial juncture. With each revelation, the complexity of the case increased rather than diminished, and I began to suspect that the truth, when finally revealed, would prove more intricate than any of us had initially imagined. The masquerade was indeed over, but the real identities of all the players in this deadly drama remained as carefully concealed as the faces that had been hidden behind elaborate masks just hours before. The afternoon light streaming through the Blue Salon's tall windows cast sharp shadows across the Persian carpet as Poirot conducted what he termed the systematic archaeology of deception. His methodical re-examination of the crime scene had taken on new urgency following the discovery of the planted emeralds and Major Arbuthnot's confession. Each piece of evidence was being reconsidered in light of these revelations, and I could see his brilliant mind working through the implications with characteristic precision. "Observe, Hastings," he said, crouching beside the faint scuff mark on the polished parquet that he had noted earlier. "This is not merely the trace of a struggle, but something far more specific. See how the mark curves, the impression of a narrow heel, twisted with deliberate grace. Not panic, but careful adjustment. Someone repositioned the victim after the initial attack, and that someone wore elegant footwear unsuited to violence." His examination extended to the servants' corridor, where he timed our passage with his pocket watch and noted subtle traces of use that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. Most significantly, he paused at the concealed door, inhaling delicately before touching a barely visible smudge on the paneling with his gloved finger. "You recall, mon ami, that Miss Crane spoke of a distinctive scent in the Blue Salon. Sharp," she said, "and lingering. He brought his finger to his nose with scientific precision. Carbolic with eucalyptus, the antiseptic signature that clings to one accustomed to medical environments. Such scents fade quickly in open air but persist for hours in enclosed spaces. The implications struck me immediately. Dr. Zimmerman? The evidence suggests someone with medical training used this passage, but we must not leap to conclusions. We proceed with method, not assumption. It was at this crucial juncture that Inspector Reynard approached with news that would fundamentally alter our understanding of the crime. A telegram from Geneva contained information about Dubois' business practices that cast his murder in an entirely different light. The diamond merchant had not been merely selling his collection to finance retirement. He had been systematically blackmailing several prominent collectors, using his intimate knowledge of their acquisitions and personal affairs to extract both money and rare objects. Most illuminating, Poirot observed as he studied the telegram's contents. Our victim was not simply a successful dealer, but a practitioner of refined extortion. This explains his mysterious business arrangements, his references to settling old accounts, and his confidence in completing unfinished business before departing for America. The revelation transformed every aspect of our investigation. Each suspect possessed not merely personal grievances against Dubois, but potentially devastating secrets that he had been exploiting. The medical manuscript coveted by Dr. Zimmerman, the family letters sought by Major Arbuthnot, even Miss Crane's brother's art dealings, all could have been sources of leverage for a skilled blackmailer. This new understanding prompted Poirot to implement what he termed the psychological experiment that reveals truth through pressure. Rather than confronting our suspects directly with accusations, he orchestrated a subtle campaign of strategic misdirection designed to force the killer into revealing themselves through action rather than words. The plan began with Miss Crane's carefully coached revelation about threatening letters she had discovered among Lady Ashworth's correspondence. The letters bore the same distinctive handwriting and sepia-tinted ink as the calling card found in Dubois' pocket, but with a crucial difference that Poirot had been waiting for someone to notice. The calling card was not written by the killer to lure Dubois to his death, Poirot explained with quiet satisfaction. It was written by Dubois himself, summoning someone to the Blue Salon for what he believed would be another profitable negotiation. Our victim orchestrated his own final meeting, confident in his ability to extract whatever he desired from his intended target. The psychological pressure of this revelation, combined with Poirot's systematic questioning about the servants' corridor and the medical scent, began to show its effects on our remaining suspects. Dr. Zimmerman's composed demeanor gave way to increasingly agitated behavior, his movements through the villa becoming more purposeful and less professional. When questioned about his activities, his explanations grew elaborate and defensive, the behavior of a man feeling the walls of deception closing around him. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Poirot made his final strategic move. He announced to the assembled suspects that microscopic analysis of the golden cord had revealed distinctive fibers that could be traced to a specific garment worn during the masquerade. The announcement was fabricated, but its effect was immediate and telling. Someone among our suspects knew that such analysis was impossible, yet feared exposure nonetheless. The guilty party will be compelled to act, Poirot confided to me as we positioned ourselves to observe the villa's various exits. They believe themselves clever, having committed what they imagine to be the perfect crime under cover of elaborate disguise. But the very precision of their planning betrays a mind that cannot resist the dramatic gesture, and that theatrical instinct will ultimately prove their undoing. The waiting began with that peculiar intensity that precedes the moment of truth in any complex investigation. Somewhere among Lady Ashworth's distinguished guests, a killer prepared for what they believed would be their final performance. But Poirot's psychological experiment had revealed more than mere guilt. It had uncovered the complex web of blackmail and deception that had made murder seem, to someone, the only possible solution to years of systematic exploitation. As the sun began to set over Lake Geneva, casting long shadows across the villa's elegant grounds, I sensed that we were approaching the climactic moment of revelation. The masquerade was indeed over, but the most dangerous deception of all still waited to be exposed. In the gathering twilight, truth and falsehood would finally be separated, and justice would at last unmask the killer who had hidden behind elaborate disguises, both literal and metaphorical. The stage was set for Poirot's final, devastating revelation, and I knew from long experience that when my friend gathered all the suspects together for his concluding exposition, the truth would prove more intricate and morally complex than any of us had dared to imagine. The evening mist began to rise from Lake Geneva as Poirot's psychological experiment reached its critical juncture. The fabricated announcement about microscopic analysis of the golden cord had achieved its intended effect, creating an atmosphere of barely contained tension throughout Villa Bellerive. Dr. Zimmermann's increasingly agitated behavior had not escaped our notice, and I observed him checking his pocket watch with unusual frequency, his distinguished composure showing hairline cracks that spoke of mounting internal pressure. It was Miss Crane who first alerted us to the disturbance, approaching with visible concern as we maintained our vigil in the drawing-room. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered urgently, "I observed Dr. Zimmermann entering the blue salon through the servants' corridor. When I offered to assist him, he became quite sharp with me, most unlike his usual courteous manner. I fear he may be attempting to interfere with the crime scene." Poirot's eyes gleamed with that particular satisfaction I had learned to associate with the moment when his carefully laid psychological traps began to yield their intended results. "The pressure, it begins to tell, mon ami. Our killer realizes that the elaborate deception is unraveling and now seeks to eliminate the final traces of their involvement. But they make the classic error of the guilty mind. They act when patience would serve them better." We approached the blue salon with silent precision, accompanied by Inspector Reynard, whose hand rested instinctively on his service revolver. The concealed door to the servants' corridor stood slightly ajar, and through the narrow opening came the sound of careful movement, someone searching with methodical desperation among the room's elegant furnishings. Dr. Zimmermann knelt beside the writing desk where Dubois had fallen. His medical bag open beside him as he examined the desk's drawers with systematic thoroughness. His distinguished bearing had given way to something approaching desperation, and his hands trembled slightly as he withdrew a small leather portfolio from a concealed compartment in the desk's base. The portfolio bore the distinctive monogram of Antoine Dubois, and its contents appeared to consist of correspondence and documents of obvious personal significance. "Dr. Zimmermann," Poirot announced with quiet authority, stepping into the salon with Inspector Reynard close behind. "I believe you are removing evidence that belongs not to you, but to the investigation of Monsieur Dubois' murder. Perhaps you would be so good as to explain your actions." The physician's reaction was immediate and telling. He straightened with the dignity of a man accepting inevitable defeat, though his keen eyes retained the sharp intelligence that had made him renowned throughout Europe. The portfolio in his hands contained not medical documents, as one might expect, but correspondence bearing the letterheads of various hospitals and professional institutions, along with what appeared to be copies of confidential medical records. "These documents," he said with quiet dignity, his voice carrying the weight of years of accumulated torment, "contain information that could destroy careers, ruin reputations, and cause immeasurable harm to innocent people. Antoine Dubois collected such material not from any scholarly interest, but as weapons to be used against those who opposed his commercial ambitions." Inspector Reynard moved closer to examine the portfolio's contents, noting official seals and confidential markings that suggested the document's sensitive nature. Medical records, patient information, among other things, yes. Dubois had somehow acquired documentation of professional indiscretions, personal scandals and financial irregularities among prominent physicians throughout Europe. He used this information to force colleagues to authenticate questionable pieces for his collection, to provide introductions to wealthy patients, and to surrender items he coveted from their own collections. The revelation transformed our understanding of the crime entirely, casting the murder in a light that revealed complex moral dimensions beyond simple greed or personal vendetta. Yet Poirot's expression remained grave as he studied the trembling physician, his brilliant mind working through the implications of this confession. "You speak of protecting innocent people, Doctor, yet you have committed murder to achieve this protection. The contradiction, it troubles the conscience, does it not?" Dr. Zimmermann's composure finally began to crack, revealing the torment that had driven him to such desperate action. "Antoine possessed records of a surgical procedure I performed 15 years ago, a case where my judgment proved fatally flawed. The patient, a young woman with her entire life ahead of her, died due to my miscalculation. The family never knew the true cause, accepting my explanation of unforeseen complications. But Antoine had acquired the autopsy records, the true medical findings that would have destroyed not only my career, but my ability to help the thousands of patients I have treated since." The confession continued with the systematic precision characteristic of his medical training, though his voice grew increasingly strained as he described the escalating demands Dubois had made over the past several months. The diamond merchant had been extracting increasingly substantial payments, culminating in the threat to expose the surgical error unless Zimmermann signed over a significant portion of his estate and provided authentication for a forged medical manuscript worth hundreds of thousands of francs. The midnight meeting was arranged at his insistence, Zimmermann explained, his hands still clutching the portfolio as if it contained his very soul. He claimed to have additional evidence that would implicate other physicians in similar cover-ups. I realized that someone had to stop him permanently, not just for my own sake, but for the sake of all his victims. Poirot listened to this partial confession with characteristic attention to detail, noting how each revelation confirmed elements of the physical evidence while revealing the deeper psychological motivations that had driven the crime. "The golden cord, Doctor? You brought it specifically for the purpose?" "From my study. I chose it for its strength and the fact that it would leave minimal forensic trace. My medical knowledge allowed me to apply exactly the pressure needed." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I deeply regret the necessity, but Antoine Dubois was a cancer on the medical profession, and cancers must be excised." Inspector Reynard prepared to make the formal arrest, but Poirot raised a restraining hand. "One moment, Inspector. Dr. Zimmermann, you have admitted to the murder, but there remain details that require clarification. The emeralds planted in Miss Crane's spectacle case, the calling card found in the victim's pocket, the careful arrangement of the crime scene. These suggest premeditation of considerable sophistication." "All true," Zimmermann acknowledged with weary resignation. "I'd been planning this for weeks, studying the villa's layout, observing the household routines, preparing for every contingency. The Masquerade provided perfect cover, but I knew that even the most careful crime would require misdirection to succeed." As the evening mist thickened around Villa Bellerive, the complex web of blackmail and murder that had culminated in the previous night's tragedy began to reveal its full dimensions. Dr. Zimmermann's confession had provided crucial confirmation of Poirot's deductions, yet I sensed that my friend was not entirely satisfied with the partial revelation. The moral complexity of the case, a blackmailer killed by one of his victims, would require careful exposition to ensure that justice was served, while acknowledging the desperate circumstances that had driven a distinguished physician to murder. "Tomorrow morning," Poirot announced as Inspector Reynard prepared to escort Dr. Zimmermann away. "We shall gather all parties in the ballroom for the complete reconstruction of this most complex case. The truth, she has many faces, and each must be revealed in its proper sequence if justice is to be served with understanding as well as authority." The masquerade was indeed over, but the final act of this tragic drama still awaited its full performance. In the gathering darkness, truth and deception would be separated with the methodical precision that only Hercule Poirot could provide, ensuring that the complex moral dimensions of the crime received the careful consideration they deserved. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ballroom of Villa Bellerive as Poirot prepared for what he termed the final performance of this most elaborate masquerade. The elegant space that had witnessed such festive gaiety 2 nights earlier now served as a theatre where truth would triumph over the most carefully constructed deceptions. Lady Ashworth had arranged the chairs in a precise semicircle, while Dr. Zimmermann sat with the resigned dignity of a man who believed his confession had resolved all questions. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began with ceremonious gravity, "we gather to examine not merely the death of Monsieur Antoine Dubois, but the complex web of noble deception that has surrounded this investigation. Dr. Zimmermann has confessed to the murder, and his confession contains much truth, but not, I regret to say, the complete truth that justice requires." Inspector Reynard shifted uncomfortably, clearly puzzled by the implication that the case remained unsolved despite the physician's detailed admission. "Monsieur Poirot, we have both confession and corroborating evidence. What further revelation can there be?" "The revelation that explains why Dr. Zimmermann, a man of unquestioned integrity, would choose to protect the real killer through false confession. The truth that exposes the actual identity of the person who strangled Antoine Dubois in the Blue Salon." The words fell into the ballroom silence like stones into still water. Poirot began his methodical reconstruction, explaining how each piece of evidence had been carefully examined and cross-referenced. The golden cord, he revealed, had not come from Dr. Zimmermann's study as claimed, but had been cut from the draperies in Lady Ashworth's private sitting room, a location to which the physician had no access. Moreover, Poirot continued, his green eyes surveying the assembled company with penetrating intensity, the medical precision claimed in the confession was contradicted by the emotional intensity evident in the strangulation itself. This was not the calculated work of a trained physician, but the desperate act of someone driven by passionate conviction. Miss Crane rose from her chair with visible agitation, her usual composed efficiency completely abandoned. "Monsieur Poirot, you cannot possibly suggest that Dr. Zimmermann is protecting someone else. His motives were clear, his confession complete." "Ah, but mademoiselle, your very protest reveals the truth Dr. Zimmermann sought to conceal. You see, the real killer possessed intimate knowledge of Villa Bellerive's layout, access to Lady Ashworth's private apartments, and, most crucially, personal knowledge of the blackmail material that Dubois had been using to destroy innocent lives. The revelation struck the assembled company with devastating force. Miss Crane's role as Lady Ashworth's secretary had provided her with unprecedented access to both the villa's secrets and her employer's correspondence. Correspondence that included letters detailing Dubois' systematic blackmail of Dr. Zimmermann and others. You discovered that your brother was among Dubois' victims, did you not? But more than that, you learned that Dr. Zimmermann, a man you had come to admire deeply, was being systematically destroyed by the diamond merchant's extortion. A distinguished physician whose ancient surgical tragedy was being used to extract money and favors while threatening to ruin a career dedicated to healing. Miss Crane's composure finally shattered completely, revealing the passionate woman concealed beneath years of professional efficiency. "Heinrich is the finest man I've ever known," she declared with fierce intensity. "His work has saved countless lives. Antoine Dubois was destroying him piece by piece, using that old tragedy to extract payment while threatening to ruin everything he had built since." The confession that followed revealed the true complexity of the crime. Miss Crane had arranged the midnight meeting using her knowledge of Dubois' habits and her access to Villa Bellerive's stationery. The golden cord had been selected not for forensic invisibility, but for symbolic appropriateness. cut from Lady Ashworth's sitting room, where she had first read the letters detailing Dubois' systematic destruction of decent people. Dr. Zimmermann's false confession now appeared in its true light, the desperate action of a man who had recognized the evidence pointing toward Miss Crane and sought to protect her through noble self-sacrifice. His medical knowledge had allowed him to construct a plausible deception, but his lack of access to certain areas of the villa had ultimately betrayed the confession's artificial nature. As Inspector Reynard prepared to make the correct arrest, Miss Crane turned to Dr. Zimmermann with tears streaming down her face. "I never intended for you to suffer for my actions, Heinrich. I thought justice would be served by removing a man who caused such harm to others." "Justice," Poirot observed quietly as the morning light strengthened over Lake Geneva, "is rarely as simple as we would wish. The victim was indeed a blackmailer who caused immeasurable suffering, yet murder cannot be justified by noble intentions. The law must be satisfied, even when our sympathies lie with the criminal rather than the victim." The masquerade was finally over, all masks removed, all deceptions exposed. In the elegant ballroom of Villa Bellerive, truth had triumphed over the most elaborate deception, though the moral complexities of the case would linger long after justice had been served. The morning sun climbed higher over Lake Geneva as Inspector Reynard formally placed Miss Dorothy Crane under arrest, her composure finally shattered, but her dignity intact. Dr. Zimmermann, released from the shadow of false accusation, stood with the bearing of a man who had aged years in a single night. His noble attempt at self-sacrifice had been exposed, yet the moral courage it represented cast him in a light that even his ancient surgical tragedy could not dim. Lady Ashworth moved through the proceedings with aristocratic grace, though I observed the slight tremor in her hands as she signed the necessary documents. The scandal would be considerable, but her primary concern seemed focused on the human cost of the tragedy that had unfolded within her elegant walls. "Inspector," Poirot said as the formalities concluded, "permit me to summarize the evidence that revealed the truth beneath Dr. Zimmermann's gallant but false confession." He moved to the center of the ballroom where the morning light illuminated every detail with crystalline clarity. First, the golden cord itself. Dr. Zimmermann claimed it came from his study, yet examination revealed silk fibers matching the draperies in Lady Ashworth's private sitting room, a location accessible only to Miss Crane in her secretarial capacity. Second, the narrow heel impression in the blue salon's Persian carpet showed not the heavy tread of a man's shoe, but the delicate pivot of a woman adjusting her balance as she applied fatal pressure. Poirot's methodical exposition continued with that precision I had come to associate with his most complex cases. The calling card bore sepia ink matching Dubois' personal pen, not the black ink of the villa's household supplies. This was written by the victim himself, summoning Miss Crane for what he believed would be another profitable negotiation. The planted emeralds, wrapped too cleanly and lacking the distinctive blue powder that clung to everything in the display case, revealed themselves as hasty deception rather than evidence of theft. Most telling of all, he concluded, was the emotional intensity evident in the strangulation itself. This was not the calculated precision of medical training, but the desperate act of someone driven by passionate conviction to protect another from systematic destruction. Miss Crane's final confession revealed the full complexity of her motivations. Her intimate knowledge of Lady Ashworth's correspondence had exposed Dubois' systematic blackmail of Dr. Zimmermann and others. The distinguished physician's ancient surgical tragedy was being weaponized to extract money and favors, threatening to destroy a career dedicated to healing. Unable to witness such systematic cruelty, she had arranged the midnight meeting using her access to villa stationery and her knowledge of Dubois' habits. Dr. Zimmermann's false confession now appeared in its true light. The desperate action of a man who had recognized the evidence pointing toward Miss Crane and sought to protect her through noble self-sacrifice. His medical knowledge had allowed him to construct a plausible deception, but the physical evidence had ultimately betrayed the confession's artificial nature. As the legal proceedings concluded, Inspector Reynard informed us that the portfolio of blackmail material found in Dubois' possession had revealed the systematic destruction of numerous careers across Europe. The diamond merchant's death had effectively ended a campaign of extortion that had caused immeasurable suffering to decent people whose only crime had been human fallibility. That afternoon, as we prepared to depart Villa Bellerive, Lady Ashworth accompanied us to our motor car. "Monsieur Poirot," she said with quiet gratitude, "your investigation has revealed truths that were painful but necessary. Dorothy's actions were inexcusable, yet I cannot help but understand the passion that drove her to such desperate measures. The human heart, madame, is the most complex mystery of all," Poirot replied with gentle courtesy. "Miss Crane believed herself to be an instrument of justice, yet she became instead an agent of tragedy. The noble intention does not excuse the criminal act, but it helps us to understand the moral complexity that surrounds such cases." As our motor car descended the winding road from Villa Bellerive for the final time, I reflected upon the intricate web of deception that had been so methodically unraveled. The Masquerade ball had provided the perfect metaphor for the entire case. Elaborate disguises concealing true identities, theatrical performances masking genuine emotions, and the moment of unmasking revealing truths more complex than anyone had anticipated. "The irony is profound, is it not, Hastings?" Poirot observed as the villa disappeared behind the trees. Antoine Dubois orchestrated his own destruction by summoning Miss Crane to that final meeting. He believed himself to be in complete control, confident in his ability to extract whatever he desired through systematic blackmail. Yet he had underestimated the protective instincts of a woman who had observed his systematic destruction of a man she had come to love. At the Grand Hôtel du Lac, Poirot settled into his precisely ordered sitting room with visible satisfaction. The case had tested his methods in ways that few investigations ever did, requiring not merely the identification of the killer, but the unraveling of noble deceptions designed to protect the guilty through self-sacrifice. The most difficult cases, Poirot mused as he arranged his notes with characteristic precision, are not those where the criminal acts from base motives, but those where good people are driven to terrible actions by circumstances beyond their control. Miss Crane believed herself to be protecting the innocent, yet she became a killer. Dr. Zimmerman sought to shield her through noble sacrifice, yet he became an obstruction to justice. As evening fell over Lake Geneva, Poirot closed his notebook on the case with quiet finality. The affair at the midnight masquerade reminds us that the human capacity for both nobility and tragedy often resides in the same heart. The masks, Hastings, they come off eventually, but sometimes it is not the mask that deceives, but the face beneath. The masquerade was over, all deceptions exposed to the merciless light of truth. Justice had been served, though its triumph was tempered by the recognition that good people, driven by noble intentions, could still choose paths that led inevitably to tragedy. The little grey cells had once again proven their supremacy over even the most elaborate deceptions, but the moral complexities revealed in the process would linger long after the legal proceedings had concluded. As I retired that evening, I reflected that this case would remain among the most memorable of our collaborations. Not for its ingenuity alone, but for its profound reminder that the human heart remains the most intricate mystery of all, capable of inspiring both the greatest nobility and the most devastating tragedy within the space of a single fateful decision.